This episode contains descriptions of violent crimes committed against children. Listener discretion is advised. Evansdale, Iowa is a small city in Black Hawk County, about 10 miles southwest of Waterloo. Evansdale and Waterloo tend to bleed into one another, as well as the city of Cedar Falls, which rest on the opposite side of Waterloo as Evansdale. Despite Evansdale having a population of just under 5,000, more than 100,000 people live in the immediate vicinity, giving it a small-town feel, but having all the benefits of a much larger suburbia. For years, Evansdale enjoyed a reputation of being a rather obscure town, hidden in the middle of the Midwest. About an hour away from Cedar Rapids and close to 2 hours away from Des Moines, it's really wedged in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, in a sleepy section of the state that does not receive much attention outside of election season. However, for the past few years, a singular story has engulfed the small town of Evansdale. It's a story that has become synonymous with the town itself, being named after the locale of this particular incident. It's a story that continues to plague discussions in and around Evansdale, to the point that a simple Google search involving the town will undoubtedly pull up at least one article describing this town's darkest hour. This is the story of the Evansdale Murders. Welcome to Unresolved. I am your host, Micheal Whelan. As I already stated at the top of the episode, this is a story that dives into the disappearance and murder of children. If you are not comfortable listening to that kind of story, then it might be a good idea to sit this one out. There's no shame in that. It's a heartbreaking story for sure, but it's one that I feel needs to be told. However, before I get into the episode itself, I just want to take a minute to let you know how you listening can help support Unresolved. You can spread the good word to your friends and family, of course, but if you want to take your support a step further and get access to bonus mini episodes, as well as my new exclusive Patreon show, Resolved, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/unresolvedpod. Once again, that's patreon.com/unresolvedpod. If you'd like to learn more about the show or myself, just listen through to the close of this episode, or hit up our website at unresolved.me. Now, without any further ado, here is the story of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins. Lyric Ray Lynn Cook-Morrissey was born on October 2nd, 2001, in Waterloo, Iowa. Her parents, Dan Morrissey and Misty Cook-Morrissey, had one child prior to Lyric, an older son named Dylan, with whom Lyric would be close. However, despite her family living in the neighboring town, Waterloo, Lyric would spend a lot of her time in Evansdale, being partially raised by her grandmother and her aunts. Both of her parents would struggle with drug abuse through Lyric's early life, so Lyric was primarily raised by her grandmother, Wilma. Despite her troubled life at home, Lyric grew up to be as normal a girl as possible. She was involved in all kinds of activities commonly associated with girls her age, such as cheerleading and gymnastics. And she also loved to spend time at the bowling alley, when she wasn't spending time outside, of course. No matter the weather, rain, snow, or shine, Lyric loved being outdoors. Lyric attended Kingsley Elementary School over in Waterloo, where she was also active in her local church. And, like many other girls growing up in the late 2000s and early 2010s, she was obsessed with the boy band One Direction. Along with two of her cousins, they had nicknamed themselves the Bradford Bad Boys after their current obsession, Zayn Malik. One of Lyric's cousins, Elizabeth Collins, was born a little under 2 years later on July 31st, 2003. Elizabeth was one of 4 children born to Drew and Heather Collins. She had one brother named Kelly, as well as 2 sisters named Amber and Callie. She was close with all of her siblings, even though she was known to boss them around constantly. Like Lyric, Elizabeth also grew up in Evansdale. However, her family life was much more stable than her cousins, and she was incredibly close with both of her parents. She attended Pointer Elementary School in Evansdale, and became a bit of a girly girl who loved makeup and nail polish and all of that stuff. In addition to singing with her friends and taking care of animals, she had a dog named Gus that she loved to baby, and the two had grown inseparable. Elizabeth also had a tougher side, which really came out when she played hockey. That was where she got to show off her more rambunctious personality, which also came out when she hung out with her friends at school. According to her 3rd grade teacher, Elizabeth was, quote, always the last one to finish her lunch because she was always talking. Lyric, Cook-Morrissey, and Elizabeth Collins were cousins related by blood through their mothers, who were sisters. They spent a lot of time together at family functions, especially since Lyric ended up spending a lot of her time in the care of her grandmother and her aunts. The cousins were close enough in age that they had many similar interests, and often hung out together during family get-togethers. When school had let out for the summer, the two ended up spending a lot of time together at their grandmother Wilma's house, where they often played cards with Wilma or rode their bikes around outside, weather permitting. That's actually what they were doing in the early afternoon of July 13th, 2012. That Friday morning, the girls had been dropped off at their grandmother Wilma's house, along Broven Boulevard in downtown Evansdale. They had been there for a short while before deciding to go on a bike ride together a little after noon, at around 12:15 p.m. At least, that's when their grandmother, Wilma Cook, recalls the two heading out to the front yard and setting off down the road together on their bikes. Sometime between 12:30 and 1 o'clock p.m., the cousins were spotted riding their bikes on Gilbert Drive, which is about 1.5 miles away from their grandmother's house. This was not too far away from Myers Lake, a local fishing and recreational hotspot. They were then spotted heading down the 1000 block of Lake Avenue, still on their bikes and together. More than an hour had passed since the girls had left their grandmother's house, and they had not yet returned. Wilma Cook was growing concerned for her granddaughter's safety, but it wasn't until Lyric's mother, Misty, returned home that the family began to panic. This is when they began calling around to friends and family in an effort to locate the girls, and began to do some preliminary searches of their own. After being unable to find Lyric and Elizabeth in the region around their grandmother's house, their family made the decision to report them as missing to the local Evansdale Police Department at around 2:48 p.m. By now, roughly 2.5 hours had lapsed since the girls had set out on their bike ride, and a search was launched in earnest to locate the two young girls. The search effort began at Wilma's house and spread outwards, towards local parks, schools, and other areas where the girls might have gone to. Within an hour, Evansdale police had been joined by deputies from the Black Hawk Sheriff's Department, as well as members of the local fire department, who began searching bike trails for the missing cousins. A find later that day inspired hope, but immediately raised some alarming questions. On a trail located near the southeast corner of Myers Lake, the bikes belonging to Lyric Cook-Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins were found. Local firefighters had made the discovery at around 4 p.m. and then forwarded the information to police. Also located at the scene was 8-year-old Elizabeth's purse, but the two girls were nowhere to be found. There seemed to be no trace of them near the location their bikes had been abandoned, nor was there any kind of clue pointing in a single direction. Police began combing through the immediate area around Myers Lake, moving outwards in the hopes of locating any kind of clue. They began trekking through the entire stretch of land that the girls had traveled, between where they had disappeared in downtown Evansdale to the location that their bikes were found near Myers Lake. Soon enough, police were joined by hundreds of volunteers who came out in droves to show support for this small town family. Not only did these volunteers help physically search for the girls over the next several days, but they began organizing candlelight vigils and press events to raise awareness and keep the story in the news for as long as possible. In the days after the disappearance of Lyric and Elizabeth, security footage was obtained from an auction house located a short distance away from their grandmother's home. This footage was brief, and the cousins only appeared in the footage for a second or two, but showed them surprisingly riding away from Myers Lake at around 12:11 p.m., a time period that fit in with the established time frame. Investigators hoped that they could pinpoint more of the girls' bike trip with similar footage from other establishments, but seemed to have had very little luck in that venture. They would have to rely upon less efficient methods of tracking the girls, such as scent dogs and witness statements. The FBI agreed to cooperate in the search for the two girls, sending some of their specially trained divers to look through Myers Lake, where their bikes had been found. Eventually, after a few days of setbacks, local officials decided to partially drain the lake to assist in this effort. but they were all ultimately fruitless in finding anything of value. Myers Lake had quickly become the primary setting for this investigation. After all, it was the location where the only real evidence had been found, the girls' bikes, and where their known path had seemed to come to an end. It was believed that if anything had happened to Lyric and Elizabeth, it had likely happened there. Investigators had yet to determine whether the cousins' disappearance was related to foul play or could have been something accidental. So cadaver dogs, infrared-equipped aircraft, and dozens of volunteers scoped the area around the lake for any sign of the girls. But following this exhaustive search around the lake, and its subsequent draining, Myers Lake proved to be a dead end for investigators. Evansdale police and Black Hawk County sheriff's officials spearheaded the investigation, but were assisted by numerous officials with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation as well as the FBI, who contributed more than 30 investigators to help search for the missing girls. While exhaustive searches were being conducted at and around Myers Lake, investigators began hitting up known sex offenders, especially those that had a history of targeting underage victims. These were not only known sexual predators, but those that had expressed any kind of interest in underage girls in the past, whether it be in child porn or anything similar. Many of these known sex offenders were interviewed multiple times by different investigators, and several were brought in to take polygraph tests. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like any of these individuals were involved, as police cleared all of them through a rigorous vetting process. Also vetted through this process were known acquaintances of the two missing girls. Their parents, family members, and family friends were interviewed by detectives, who looked for any signs of deception in not only physical interviews, but written statements and outside correspondence. The family members of the two girls agreed to have their phones and other electronic devices searched for any concerning communications, but nothing was found. To police, it seemed like this might have been the worst possible outcome, as it was becoming clearer and clearer that the girls had likely been taken by a complete stranger, someone that was not familiar to them prior to their disappearance. As I'll get into in a bit, this happens in an incredibly small fraction of cases and is incredibly rare. For an extended period of time, local police continued to receive tips from the public. For the first few weeks at least, police officials estimate that they received roughly 20 tips per hour, but by the end of the summer, that number had decreased to roughly 40 a day. By July 20th, roughly a week after Lyric and Elizabeth disappeared, police seemed to have ruled out any accidental causes, such as drowning, etc. This development allowed them to move the scope of the investigation fully to an abduction, with them believing that foul play was undoubtedly involved in this case. However, everyone involved continued to hope that the girls were alive, and that they could be brought home safely. Sandy Brault, a spokeswoman for the FBI, stated later that month, quote, "We believe these girls are alive, and we are not discouraged by the passage of time since their disappearance. We are urging anyone with information to come forward. Any information, as insignificant as it may seem, could be vital to this investigation." As journalists and media personalities began to focus in on the missing girls from Evansdale, those that were close to them, in particular their family members, found themselves facing some intense public scrutiny, and none were more vilified in the press than the father of 10-year-old Lyric Cook, named Dan Morrissey. At the time, Dan Morrissey was a 36-year-old father of two who had already divorced Lyric's mother, Misty. As interested parties began to look into Dan's past, they discovered that he was involved in several ongoing criminal cases. In fact, he had been let out of police custody to be with his family following Lyric's disappearance. The crimes that Dan was alleged to have been involved in included everything from assaulting his ex-wife to multiple drug felonies, including manufacturing, possessing, and dealing methamphetamine in large quantities. He was actually looking at decades behind bars if convicted, which he eventually was the following year, 2013. Morrissey expressed his innocence, both to law enforcement and the press, and stated that he was just an addict spiraling out of control following the disappearance of his daughter. He would state in his defense that he began consuming significant amounts of methamphetamine after Lyric disappeared, but that was disputed by the Black Hawk County Attorney's Office, who stated that Dan was involved in the production of meth both before and after his daughter disappeared. In fact, he was making meth in his home while his 17-year-old son, Lyric's brother, was still living there. In 2013, Dan Morrissey was convicted and sentenced to more than 90 years in prison, with Judge David Stout stating during his sentencing, "Since you were released from custody after your daughter's unfortunate event, you were utilizing other women you knew to go to stores to buy or steal pseudoephedrine so you could manufacture methamphetamine. The fact that your child was in your home when you were arrested on these events shows that you don't use good judgment concerning yourself as a parent to subject them to those conditions, to those situations, to those individuals, and to that behavior is certainly not good parenting." Despite being found guilty of numerous drug charges and facing a bid of at least 30 years in prison, Dan Morrissey continues to assert that he had nothing to do with his daughter's or his niece's disappearance. He claims that the belief that they might have been taken due to some drug debt held by someone in the region, or as retribution for his criminal activity, does not seem to hold much water. Speaking to local news station KWWL in 2018, Dan stated, quote, "Yeah, it doesn't even make sense if you think about it and play it out. You know, why would this happen? If I had any idea of somebody that was in my life, that I owed money to or had threatened me or anything, you'd think I wouldn't know who that person is? So I mean, that would be the number one suspect on the case and this thing would have been solved a long time ago. But there is absolutely nobody in my life that I owe money to, or that I have told on, or anything like that. That has nothing to do with my daughter. And why would they abduct Elizabeth and my daughter at the same time in another town that my daughter's not even from, on a random bike ride that nobody knew they were going to take? It doesn't make sense." Over the next several months, the other three parents became notable figures in their own right, as they fought for answers regarding their still missing daughters. Misty Cook, Lyric's mom and Dan Morrissey's ex-wife, struggled significantly in the aftermath of her daughter's disappearance. She stayed active in the search for Lyric, constantly appearing on television programs and news broadcasts alongside her sisters and other family friends. She even began reaching out for media figures like John Walsh to step in and help, at one point even sending Walsh a public message through Facebook that included the line, "I am in my darkest hour and close to the edge." The following day, Monday, August 20th, Misty was rushed to Allen Hospital after being found unresponsive at her home. She had mixed her medication with alcohol, resulting in her losing consciousness and being rushed to the hospital when she was found. She would recover, but continued spiraling in the following months, slipping down the treacherous path of drug abuse that she had struggled to dig herself out of for years. In 2014, Misty was sentenced to 10 years in prison for drug-related offenses, but would be released from prison about a year later. Thankfully, when she was eventually released, she was on the straight and narrow again and looked to get her life back together. Meanwhile, 8-year-old Elizabeth's parents, Drew and Heather Collins, struggled to make sense of their daughter's tragic disappearance. Heather became a regular in downtown Evansdale, giving out flyers and posters with the girl's images to anyone that seemed interested. She even began collecting signatures for a petition to change the Amber Alert laws, believing that the system waited too long to report the disappearance of the two girls. Both of Elizabeth's parents would appear on television whenever possible to plead for their daughter's safe return, but unfortunately, their marriage would not be able to last. Shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance, the two began to drift apart, eventually deciding that divorce was the best step for them. They would remain cordial and friendly for their family, of course, always hoping that Elizabeth would return to them, even though days, weeks, and months continued to pass. It wasn't until the end of 2012 that the family of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins received any kind of update. Seven Bridges Wildlife Park is about 20 miles northeast of Evansdale, in Bremer County. Known primarily as a hunting ground, Seven Bridges is no stranger to illicit or unsavory behavior. Once upon a time ago, this had been the scene for underage parties. For decades, dating back to the 1970s, Seven Bridges Park had been a place for high school students to meet up with other teenagers to engage in underage drinking, bonfires, and other kinds of rebellious activities away from prying eyes. but over time, it had lost that luster, and instead became a park and dumping ground that only locals seemed to know about. That did not mean that it wasn't a haven for trouble, though. Starting in the mid-2000s, Seven Bridges Park had seen dozens of trips from Bremer County Sheriff's deputies, who were called to respond to everything from the dumping of a roving meth lab to hooligans tearing up the park with ATVs. It was usually minor stuff like that, which was more annoying than actually troubling. But close to 6 months after the disappearance of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins, deputies were called out to a scene unlike anything they had previously seen at Seven Bridges. Early in the day, on Wednesday, December 5th, 2012, a group of hunters had been moving through Seven Bridges Park when they came upon 2 sets of human remains. The remains had been somewhat shrouded in an isolated area of the park, where foot traffic wasn't a huge concern. In fact, investigators stated that the remains were placed in a location that someone would have had to have almost been on top of to notice. If anyone was walking just a few feet away from the remains, they likely would have missed them. These 2 sets of human remains appeared to be smaller in stature, and, by all accounts, appeared female. That's what police reported later in the day, after receiving a call from the hunters at around 12:45 that afternoon. Soon, the area around Seven Bridges Park, which was primarily known for raccoon hunting, was overrun with police officers, investigators, and then journalists. The remains were sent off to the state medical examiner's office for identification, but most believed that these were the 2 missing girls from Evansdale, Lyric and Elizabeth. The following day, Thursday, December 6th, 2012, Chief Deputy Rick Abbin of the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. During this conference, he announced that officials were confident that the 2 bodies found at the Seven Bridges Wildlife Park were, indeed, Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins. Despite investigators not yet receiving test results back from the state medical examiner's office, there were no other missing persons cases from the region. At least, none with 2 similar victims, and the smaller stature of the remains hinted at them being children.
I have a news release that I will read to you. The investigation continues in the discovery of 2 bodies that was reported on December 5th, 2012. At this time, we can confirm that yesterday at approximately 12:45 p.m., hunters discovered 2 bodies at Seven Bridges Conservation Area near Reedland, Iowa, in Bremer County. Those bodies have been transported to the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office in Ankeny for autopsy and positive identification. The Seven Bridges Wildlife Area will be closed to public access until at least this coming Monday. At this time, law enforcement is confident, based upon evidence at the scene and preliminary investigation, that the bodies found yesterday are those of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins. However, the results of the autopsy have not been made available to law enforcement, and a positive forensic identification of the bodies has not been made. Once those results are available to us, after we have made notification to the family, we will notify the media and the community. Due to a large area surrounding where the bodies was discovered, evidence teams from the Bremer and Black Hawk County Sheriff's Office, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are conducting a thorough search in and around the discovery location. The duration of that search may last several days. Investigators from local, state, and federal agencies are continuing to investigate the disappearance of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins in relationship to this discovery. New leads continue to come into law enforcement, and investigators are following up on those leads, as well as information that is being derived from other sources. We are asking that anyone with information in this case, particularly if it involves suspicious activity in around the Seven Bridges Conservation Area, to contact the Evansdale Police Department tip line at 319-232-6682 or Cedar Valley Crime Stoppers at 1-855-300-TIPS. Information can still be emailed to ourmissingiowagirls@dps.state.ia.us. A $150,000 reward is still available through law enforcement, and a separate reward fund through the Cedar Valley Crime Stoppers is still accepting donations to be paid out for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those persons or persons responsible. And that's what I have for you at this time. If you have questions, I will attempt to answer a few for you. Yes, sir.
The time that's elapsed, how big of a problem is that going to be in terms of gathering evidence? Because normally you'll be on the scene, much quicker than 4 to 5 months.
We have plenty of people that are out there. They're well trained. They know what they're doing, and so we will gather whatever is out there.
Okay. Everything that you talked about yesterday was hinting at that it was the girls. What led you to believe that right away?
We have no one else that's missing in this area. We have 2 bodies that were found. They were smaller in stature, so we had no thing to think other than that at this time.
It might be helpful for our viewers if you were to tell us a bit more in terms of how long you believe the bodies may have been there.
I have no idea. We will rely on the state medical examiner's office to assist us with that.
Is this an area that had been searched before?
I'm sure that the sheriff's office from Bremer County, we asked the surrounding counties to check parks and so forth. However, this area was not right on the road itself, so if that area was checked, I'm not certain.
Can you tell whether the bodies were in any way buried or concealed?
I will not answer that for you.
Can you talk about the impact that the lack of rain and snow that we've had on the evidence and the site there?
No, because I'm not trained in forensics or anything like that. The evidence is what it is, and it's being handled by the state medical examiner's office.
Did the hunters think they had found the girls when they came upon them, since they're likely from the area and knew the story?
They notified law enforcement of their find, and I have not talked to them, so I don't know what they said.
Deputy,
Okay.
do you consider this a homicide investigation?
We considered it an abduction at the time, and we're still proceeding with that. I would say that we are looking that way at this time. We have 2 bodies, but we're going to rely on the state medical examiner to tell us what they think.
Have the families been allowed to view the bodies?
No, they have not, and there's no reason for that at this time.
Any type of a timeline in terms of things like autopsy?
I do not know. That's up to the state medical examiner. We've been in contact with them, and they sent one of their people up here, and so it takes whatever it takes. Okay, that's all I have for you. We will, as I said, this will be the last news conference. There's no sense in having you folks come back day after day. As soon as I have more to get to you, we will put that out through the email system.
This announcement seemed to provide the loved ones of the cousins an answer for what had happened to them, but it was anything but conclusive. Details of the girls' death have never been publicly released, such as their cause or means of death, and police officials did not release any detail that inspired confidence in justice being found anytime soon. This public announcement of the girls' bodies being found, but their case remaining as unsolved as ever, led to an ominous haze that began to settle over the region of Evansdale, a dark cloud that has yet to lift several years later. The next Monday, December 10th, 2012, the Iowa State Medical Examiner's Office publicly confirmed that the bodies found were Lyric and Elizabeth. They provided information to the local police chief, Kent Smock, who then informed the families before the press obtained the news. That evening, Heather Collins, 8-year-old Elizabeth's mother, posted a public message on her Facebook page, which read, "We have been so blessed by the outpouring of all the prayers and support tonight with the gut-wrenching news that my beautiful daughter and my niece's bodies were found by hunters. This was not the outcome we wanted, but we know that they are up in heaven with our Savior, and our nightmare of where they are and what is happening to them has been answered. Local ceremonies were arranged for the two girls, with lyrics taking place on December 29th at the Heartland Vineyard Church in Cedar Falls. Elizabeth's ceremony took place on December 13th, but a graveside ceremony was held months later, in May of 2013, which featured more than 200 people, as well as Elizabeth's pet dog, Gus, who was able to say goodbye to his best friend, wearing a rose on his collar in honor of Elizabeth, who was finally put to rest. Both of the cousins were memorialized at the location where their bikes had been found, Myers Lake. The trail that goes around the lake was renamed the Trail of Angels, and memorials for both Lyric and Elizabeth were added throughout the park, which had been renamed Angels Park. People in the region, and supporters of the family, had raised thousands of dollars to renovate the park in their honor, and even arranged for a painted mural of the girls to face the nearby highway. In addition, July 13th would forever be known as Lyric and Elizabeth Day in Evansdale, which refused to forget the two girls, whose names had almost become synonymous with the small town itself. Their deaths would even inspire legislation in Iowa, as state legislators moved to bring back the death penalty for child murderers, and changes were proposed to the Amber Alert laws. Despite the appropriately named Cousins Act ultimately not passing, this did lead to some changes in the Amber Alert system, which allowed more instantaneous alerts to hit regions that children had gone missing, which the Cook and Collins families believe might have made a difference in their abduction. To this day, Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins have not been forgotten, and their unsolved murders continue to haunt those in and around Evansdale. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. While those that knew and loved both Lyric Cook-Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins had to put the girls to rest and mourn their lives, which had been lost far too soon, the investigation into their deaths continued on. Now, it was expanding from a missing persons investigation into a much more nefarious double murder, which changed things significantly. You see, the double murder of two children at the same time is a rare offense for even violent crime standards. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, commonly abbreviated as NCMEC, states that the abductions of random children are already rare. Most of these offenses take place over the internet and are arranged ahead of time by the culprits. But the actual snatching of children off of the streets is incredibly rare. Two children being abducted at once, in the middle of the day, is even more rare. It happens in a very small fraction of disappearances, with most cases involving a family member or a family friend of some kind. The abduction of two children at once, in broad daylight, was such a rare offense that the FBI had only recorded roughly 15 similar incidents between 1974 and the date that the cousins went missing in July of 2012. Yet, after spending so long investigating the parents and known acquaintances of the two girls, investigators had reasonably ruled out anyone in their social circle, so it seemed like this was one of those extremely rare circumstances, where an opportunistic predator had managed to corner or lure both of the girls into a vehicle, and had likely driven them elsewhere, possibly to Seven Bridges Park, but details are pretty scarce when it comes to the actual police investigation. Investigators have concealed many of the intimate details of this case. Details such as how the girls had been killed, where they had been killed, whether they obtained DNA from the crime scene, etc. These are details that they have chosen to keep private, likely in an attempt to weed out false confessions. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of the bodies being discovered in December of 2012, police would receive two separate confessions from men claiming to be the killer. In both of these cases, though, police were able to eliminate these men as viable suspects because they did not know those intimate details. And in their confession, they got inherent facts incorrect. These details continue to be closely guarded more than 5 years later, as the case continues to be looked at by local, county, state, and even federal officials. Approximately 6 months after the bodies of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins were found in Seven Bridges Park, Another troubling case began to play out in Dayton, Iowa. On May 20th, 2013, 15-year-old Kathleen Shepard was walking home from school with a 12-year-old friend of hers. While walking home, the two girls were abducted by a man that was able to lure them into his vehicle under the threat of violence. After getting into the man's truck, their abductor drove them around for a bit, crisscrossing through the immediate area, which was mainly rural farmland. He then drove the two girls to a pig farm that he worked at, which was quiet and isolated. There, the abductor zip-tied the girls' hands and began separating them. He led away 15-year-old Kathleen Shepard first, but left the other girl unsupervised in his truck. This girl, a 12-year-old that had been left alone, was able to escape the truck just moments later. She ran off in an effort to find help, which she did find just minutes later. When police arrived at the scene, they discovered a troubling sight. The abductor's truck was still at the location, but his body was inside. He had taken his own life in an effort to escape culpability, but 15-year-old Kathleen Shepard was nowhere to be found. Her body would later be discovered in the Des Moines River several weeks later, about 20 miles downriver from this pig farm. She had been stabbed and beaten to death, the victim of a senseless abduction and murder. The deceased abductor was later identified as Micheal Klunder, a registered sex offender from Stratford, Iowa, that had spent the better part of 2 decades in prison for kidnapping and assaulting a woman, in addition to kidnapping 2 3-year-olds. Thankfully, all of those prior victims had survived, but Klunder would return to violent crime in 2013, abducting Kathleen and her friend, and likely planning to kill and/or sexually assault both. However, instead of facing any consequences for his actions, this piece of shit had decided to take his own life at the crime scene, leaving the family of Kathleen Shepard with little in the ways of justice or resolution. This abduction came less than a year after the disappearance of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins, which had unfolded about 100 miles west of Evansdale, in Dayton, Iowa. From the very beginning, the similarities between the two cases intrigued investigators, who began digging into the history of Micheal Klunder, looking for any possibility that he might have been involved in the Evansdale murders. In addition to the troubling circumstances of the abductions, with 2 girls being abducted at the same time in broad daylight after being incentivized by violence, it was learned that Klunder had been released from prison in 2011, the year before Lyric and Elizabeth had gone missing. However, after months of investigating, by 2014, it seemed like investigators had effectively ruled out Micheal Klunder as a suspect in the Evansdale case. Special agents with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation had spent months comparing the 2 cases, and were pretty confident that Micheal Klunder was not involved in the Evansdale case, not only because of forensic differences in the crimes, but due to Klunder potentially having an alibi. It is believed that Micheal Klunder was not near Evansdale when the 2 girls went missing, having been in or around his home in Stratford, Iowa at the time the cousins were abducted. Despite police ruling him out as a suspect, many continue to have suspicions about Klunder, and with him no longer being here to answer for himself, many of those questions remain unanswered. Kent Smock, the Evansdale police chief, would state about Klunder, quote, "I think people were kind of hoping this would be the end of it. Ruling him out, that means the person is still out there." On June 24th, 2013, close to a year after the 2 girls had gone missing, Evansdale police announced that a tip had led to a new lead in the investigation. This was now inspiring some hope for resolution in the case, and investigators believed that this tip might eventually lead them to their culprit. This tip revolved around a description of a large, white, full-sized, old-model SUV, possibly a Chevy Suburban or a Ford Bronco, which had been spotted by multiple witnesses near the crime scene between 11:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m. on July 13th, 2012. This would fit in with the established time frame that the crime had occurred, and more than one witness had even placed this vehicle in the vicinity of the abduction. 3 separate witnesses, in fact, had seen this vehicle on Arbutus Avenue at around the time the girls went missing, which is located just next to Lake Avenue, where the girls had last been seen, as well as next to Myers Lake, where their bikes had been found. 2 of the witnesses had reported seeing this white SUV to police during their initial canvass, claiming to have seen it parked between bike trail signs. However, it wasn't until the third witness reported seeing the same SUV close to a year later that police went back over their notes and began to notice the potential significance in this lead. The third witness, who came forward in June of 2013, reported seeing this white SUV near the woods on the east side of the lake, which was incredibly close to where the girls' bikes would be found later that afternoon. Police forwarded this tip to the media and asked for anyone with information to come forward. They continue to believe that this information could be vital for the investigation, and think that any additional information could get the ball rolling on the case once again. If this sounds familiar to any of you, please don't be shy. Your information could make a world of difference. In 2014, Evansdale police announced that they were dedicating a portion of their website to be specifically aimed at releasing news and information about the ongoing investigation, the murder of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins, which had become their biggest and most infuriating unsolved case by far. This page can be found at evansdalepolice.org/latestonlyricandelizabeth.php. And it includes information about the investigation, as well as a suspect profile, which was made public for the first time when this page was created in 2014. This profile was created with help from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which concluded that the alleged culprit of this unsolved double murder was a local that blended in with the Evansdale or Black Hawk County community, who acted upon an opportunity to abduct the two girls. Someone that was undoubtedly familiar with the Myers Lake/Angel Park area, as well as Seven Bridges Park, meaning that they were unlikely to have been a transient or a wanderer. Police insist that the location where the bodies were found, Seven Bridges Park, was without a doubt familiar to the killer, as it is still relatively isolated and not well known outside of those from the region, indicating that the killer is, or was, a local. Someone who would use quiet coercion to convince the two girls to go with him or her, either a trick or ruse of sorts, or some kind of threat of violence. Someone who was likely facing significant stress in their life, such as legal issues, mental health problems, issue with a spouse, etc., who decided to lash out at two young strangers instead of those close to them. Either someone who followed along closely with the investigation, or someone that tried to distance themselves as much as possible. Someone that had likely attempted abductions in the past, and had likely expressed interest in underage girls. And, finally, they were likely someone that may have attempted to alter their physical appearance as well as the appearance of their vehicle in the immediate aftermath, which again, was in July of 2012. In November of 2016, in the small town of Onawa, Iowa, a little over 200 miles to the west of Evansdale, two elementary school girls returned home in a hurry. They told their family that a man had attempted to lure them into a vehicle just moments prior. Two of their older relatives and a neighbor decided to jump into a car and chase after the vehicle that had attempted to lure the two girls, which was just now leaving the neighborhood. The vehicle, a silver gray 2004 Ford Focus, was easy to catch up to, but the driver tried to distance himself from the pursuing vehicle when he realized that he had been caught. The car of young adults was able to keep pace with the man in the Ford Focus, a middle-aged white man with dark hair and a goatee, who appeared to be a little heavy-set. When the vehicles pulled up alongside one another, the man behind the wheel of the Ford Focus claimed that he was an undercover police officer, and threatened violence against his pursuers. Yet they stayed on him for several miles, pursuing him out of town until police were able to show up and arrest the man. The man's identity was revealed as 58-year-old Jeff Altmeyer, who lived in Ankeny, Iowa. He had served in the National Guard between 1977 and 1983, and was, by all accounts, a pretty regular guy. He had been married for over 30 years, and now had two adult children that had moved out of his house. He had spent decades working for security companies before becoming an independent security consultant. At the time of his arrest in 2014, Altmeyer was working as a traveling auto damage field inspector, which allowed him to travel through Iowa and the Midwest pretty regularly. Jeff Altmeyer was arrested and charged with trying to entice children, a crime that he had apparently been committing all over Iowa, not only in Onawa, which resides in Monona County, but also in Jasper and Grunder counties. In fact, between May and December of 2016, Altmeyer had attempted to lure dozens of underage girls into his car, at times actually succeeding. Some of these girls were let go a block or two away, but on at least 2 occasions, Altmeyer had sexually assaulted these victims, who ranged in age from 6 to 13 years old. Eventually, Altmeyer was sentenced to life in prison for his offenses, but investigators continue to believe that he might have been responsible for other crimes. Their rationale is that criminals generally don't start at the age of 58, and that him having successfully gotten away with a crime might have emboldened him to lash out in a spree of sorts, which is what he was eventually convicted of. Mitch Mortvedt, the head of field operations for the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, stated about Jeff Altmeyer, quote, "It's very concerning to us when you have an individual like that has the access that he does through his employment at the time to basically roam the state or roam the Midwest." Following his conviction for numerous abductions and abduction attempts, Jeff Altmeyer has been investigated as a potential lead in the Evansdale case. However, nothing definitive has linked him to the crimes as of yet. At least, nothing that officials feel confident in releasing to the public, keeping themselves pretty tight-lipped about their ongoing investigation. Mike Rohrkassi, a special agent with the Iowa DCI, addressed Altmeyer's possible connection to the Evansdale case in no certain terms just a couple of years ago, in 2017. Quote, "The most I would say is that he is one of our leads, and I will leave it at that." Belle Plaine, Iowa is a small town roughly 40 miles south of Evansdale, which is really in the middle of nowhere. Built as a railroad town in the middle of the Civil War, the population has languished between 2,000 and 3,000 in the decades since, and the town itself hasn't changed much over the past half-century or so. On May 4th, 2018, Belle Plaine would make national headlines for perhaps the worst of reasons. That day, a Union Pacific train was heading from Chicago, Illinois to Nebraska along one of the region's dedicated coal rails, and everything was going along swimmingly until shortly before 5 a.m. That is when it was reported that an incident had occurred involving 2 people, a mother and a son, both of whom had lost their lives in a tragic accident along the railroad. The casualties were later identified as 35-year-old Teresa Girsch and her 8-year-old son Henry Fields, both of whom were locals. The incident was initially reported as a tragic accident, but as police began to learn more, they realized that it was no accident. Due to interviews with Teresa's friends and family, which gave them context for her deteriorated mental state, as well as footage obtained from the train, police labeled this ordeal as a murder-suicide, with Teresa having killed herself and her son by pulling them onto the tracks at the last moment, ending both of their lives in an instant. This incident led to a weeks-long investigation, which aimed to understand why this woman had decided to end both her son's life as well as her own. Police were able to learn that 35-year-old Teresa Girsch had been struggling through numerous mental health issues, and had been going through counseling, in addition to being on a number of medications. During meetings with support specialists in the months prior to this incident, Teresa had reportedly told them that she felt like, quote-unquote, standing in front of a train, and had even made mention of knowledge she possessed, pertaining to a high-profile double murder from the region. As you can already imagine, this was the unsolved double murder from Evansdale, which was just 40 or so miles away from Belle Plaine. Teresa had spoken to her counselors about supposed evidence she held in her possession. A 6-page letter she claims had been written by the killers of Lyric Cook and Elizabeth Collins. These were apparently men that Teresa had hung around in the months and years prior, and according to her, in this letter, these men had confessed to the double murder in explicit detail. Following the death of Teresa and her son, a search warrant was executed on her home. In the search warrant, police had used specific details obtained from Teresa's specialist, including a tidbit about this supposed letter from one of her counselors, named Julie Croft. Quote, "When asked to be more specific, Julie stated that it has to do with the 2 girls in the woods near Evansdale. During the subsequent search of Teresa's property, several of her belongings were taken away by investigators, including notebooks, sealed envelopes, and multiple cell phones. However, it seems like whatever information police were able to obtain from Teresa's belongings, including presumably from this supposed letter, was irrelevant, or simply outdated. Police claim that they were unable to learn anything new from Teresa Girsch's belongings, adding that her deteriorated mental state had likely made it hard for her to differentiate between what was real and what was fiction. They referred to the letter in her possession as containing quote-unquote old information that they had received in the past, nothing new or revelatory. It is unknown if the death of Teresa Girsch or her son Henry Fields was linked in any way to the unsolved double murder from Evansdale. However, it did lead to a brief resurgence of interest in the case, and it remains a bizarre incident that many believe might share some connection, no matter how tentative. In the nearly 7 years since the murder of Lyric, Cook-Morrissey, and Elizabeth Collins, Evansdale has yet to shake the memory of their murder. In fact, most discussions about Evansdale eventually turn to a discussion of the case itself, which continues to shock those in the region close to a decade after the fact. The current state of the investigation is open, with police having interviewed more than 1,000 people in their search for answers. This includes interviews with more than 300 sex offenders from the region, and investigators continue to stockpile tips from the public, having obtained literally thousands of them in the years since Lyric and Elizabeth disappeared. This case has been linked to a number of similar cases through the Midwest, including some I've already mentioned in this episode. Many think that the double murder bears many similarities to the spree perpetrated by Jeff Altmeyer, while others continue to believe that Micheal Klunder remains a more likely culprit. Others even point to the high-profile double murders over in Delphi, Indiana, as possibly being related. That's a case I have not covered on this podcast quite yet, but I will very soon, and I'll explore this possible connection in more detail then. However, police continue to look for answers, and are quick to state that this will never become a quote-unquote cold case. Evansdale Police Chief Jeff Jansen stated just a few years ago, quote, "I don't want to consider this a cold case because we are still actively working on it. Nobody has put it on a shelf and said we're done with this. We are still scratching for every little lead we can get. A reward of $170,000 exists for information leading to the arrest and prosecution of the person or persons responsible. This was a reward raised primarily by private interest, with more than $100,000 being contributed by an anonymous donor, and $20,000 being added to the fund by the FBI. The loved ones of Lyric and Elizabeth continue to hope for some kind of resolution in this case, remaining as active as possible in the community and the hunt for their loved one's killer. In October of this year, 2019, Lyric would have been celebrating her 18th birthday. Perhaps she would have been moving on to college, or whatever the next chapter of her life would have been. The same goes for Elizabeth Collins, who would be turning 16, perhaps obtaining her driver's license and entering the thick of her high school career. This unknown killer has taken that away from these two cousins, in addition to a lifetime of memories that could have been shared with their loved ones. I hope to bring you an update in this case in the near future, but until such a time, the stories of Lyric Cook-Morrissey and Elizabeth Collins remain unresolved. Thank you for listening to Unresolved. If you would like to learn more about the show or myself, please consider checking out the podcast website at unresolved.me. There, you could find links to anything you might need, email contact forms, transcripts of each episode, a list of sources and musical artists used, and even links to the podcast store or the Patreon page, where you can help support the show. Patreon supporters can also get access to bonus mini episodes of the podcast, in addition to episodes of my new podcast, Resolved. Resolved is only available on Patreon and covers stories that, unlike this show, have some kind of resolution. Episode 1 focused on the conviction of Tim Lambesis, the frontman of the band As I Lay Dying. Episode 2, which is due out the day after this episode is being released, focuses on the rather shaky grounds that a man was convicted on for murdering a teenage girl in California. Once again, you could find out more details at the Unresolved Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/unresolvedpod. Now, I'm going to keep this one brief, and I'm going to get out of here, but I hope to have another new episode ready for you next weekend. Thank you to everyone listening for your continued support, and until next time, stay safe. I'll talk to you later. Cheers.